I am Audrey, 33 years old, and I never expected a $99 truffle roast chicken to be the catalyst that would send my arrogant brother-in-law to federal prison and leave my golden child sister homeless. When my mother tossed cheap paper napkins at my starving children while hoarding the leftovers of an expensive meal for her favorite grandchildren, they all laughed at my silence. They thought my quiet demeanor was the pathetic submission of a broke, divorced single mother who was just lucky to be invited to a luxury dinner. They had absolutely no idea I was silently calculating the exact moment to freeze their bank accounts and seize every asset they claimed to own. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to let toxic family members dig their own financial graves. The ambient lighting of Lumiere, one of the most exclusive and ridiculously overpriced restaurants in the city, cast a warm glow over our private VIP table. The air was thick with the scent of shaved truffles, butter, and the distinct aroma of old money. But at our table, the only thing thicker than the rich culinary scents was the suffocating cloud of disrespect. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting in my lap, while my 8-year-old son Leo and my 6-year-old daughter Mia fidgeted in their oversized velvet chairs. They were hungry. We had been sitting there for over an hour, and they had not been offered a single bite of actual food. Directly across from me sat my sister Penelope. At 31 years old, Penelope was the family undisputed golden child, a title she wore as proudly as the gleaming Chanel bag resting on the empty chair beside her. She was meticulously transferring the remains of a $99 whole roasted truffle chicken into a pristine white to-go box. The chef had carved it right at the table, a grand presentation that ended with Penelope claiming the entirety of the untouched half. "These will be perfect for my boys to eat for lunch tomorrow," Penelope declared, snapping the box shut with a smug smile. She did not even glance at Leo or Mia, whose eyes were locked on the golden, crispy skin of the chicken disappearing into the cardboard container. Mia whimpered softly, pulling on my sleeve to whisper that her stomach hurt from being so empty. Hearing this, my mother Brenda sighed dramatically. She reached into her designer purse, pulled out a handful of thin, rough paper napkins she must have hoarded from a coffee shop, and tossed them carelessly across the mahogany table. The rough paper squares scattered across the white tablecloth in front of my children like worthless falling leaves. "Your kids can eat when you get home, Audrey," my mother said, her voice dripping with that familiar, condescending tone she reserved exclusively for me. "Wipe their faces. They look shiny. You really should not have brought them to a place like this if they could not handle the weight." Before I could even process the sheer audacity of her statement, my brother-in-law DeAndre let out a booming theatrical laugh. DeAndre was a mid-level corporate executive who walked around acting like he owned the entire Eastern Seaboard. He adjusted his silk tie, leaning back in his chair with the arrogant posture of a man who believed he was completely untouchable. "Exactly," DeAndre chimed in, flashing a condescending grin. "Feed them a sandwich before you come next time, Audrey. This is fine dining, not a charity soup kitchen. We are trying to enjoy a luxury experience here, and whining kids really ruin the aesthetic." My mother chuckled, nodding in vigorous agreement. "DeAndre is right, sweetheart. You know how hard he works to provide this lifestyle. Penelope married a real provider. You really need to be more considerate of their generosity." Penelope leaned forward, her eyes scanning my simple navy blue dress and the scuffed heels of my sensible work shoes. "It is just a shame," she murmured, dripping with fake sympathy. "I know the divorce hit you hard, and living on a single income, with a basic desk job, must be so stressful. But you really need to stop relying on us for a taste of the good life. You cannot afford this world, Audrey. Just accept it." I never yelled, I did not cry. I simply looked at Penelope's Chanel bag, then at DeAndre's smug face, and finally at my mother, who was practically glowing with pride at her wealthy son-in-law. They thought they had me completely figured out. They thought I was a fragile, destitute woman clinging to the bottom rung of their ladder. I placed my hand gently over Mia's small fingers, offering her a reassuring squeeze. Got it, I said quietly. My silence was the appetizer they craved. They devoured my submission, completely unaware that I was the one who actually owned the table they were sitting at. DeAndre snapped his fingers in the air, a loud, sharp sound that echoed across the dining room. Several patrons turned their heads, their expressions a mix of annoyance and curiosity. He did not care. In his mind, he was the most important person in the room. Waiter, he bellowed, waving his hand toward the impeccably dressed staff standing near the kitchen entrance. Bring the check, and make it quick. I have early meetings tomorrow, important ones. My mother practically beamed her chest, puffing out with pride. Oh, DeAndre, you work entirely too hard, she cooed, reaching over to pat his hand. You really are the pillar of this family. I simply do not know what Penelope would do without such a strong, capable provider. DeAndre smirked, reaching into the breast pocket of his tailored suit. He pulled out a heavy, sleek black metal card and tossed it onto the center of the table. It landed with a solid clink against the polished wood. The gold lettering caught the ambient light, displaying the logo of Apex Industries. It was a corporate expense card, the kind reserved only for top-tier executives. Just got the limits raised on this beauty, DeAndre announced, tapping the card with his index finger. The regional vice president promotion comes with its perks. The company wants me entertaining clients in style, but tonight, I am treating my beautiful wife and my wonderful mother-in-law. He paused, letting his gaze slide over to me, his smile twisting into a sneer. And of course, we cannot forget our favorite charity case. Consider this my good deed for the month, Audrey. I know things have been tight for you since you moved out of that tiny apartment. I lived in a 3-bedroom house, but I let him talk. Penelope laughed, a high-pitched grating sound. Honestly, Audrey, she said, stirring her sparkling water with a silver spoon, you should be thanking him. When was the last time you ate somewhere that did not have a drive-through window? You really need to learn how to manage your finances better. Maybe if you applied yourself, you could find a husband who actually wants to stick around, or at least get a job that pays more than minimum wage. My mother nodded solemnly, as if Penelope had just delivered a profound truth. Your sister is right, Audrey. You have always lacked ambition. Even when you were little, you never pushed yourself the way Penelope did. That is why she is sitting here in designer clothes, and you are wearing a dress that looks like it came from a discount rack. The injustice of her words burned, but it was a familiar burn. Growing up, Penelope was showered with praise for simply breathing, while my straight-A report cards were dismissed as expected. When my mother needed a loan for a new kitchen, she guilted me into giving her my savings. When Penelope wanted a lavish wedding, my mother remortgaged her house. Now they were sitting here funded by a corporate card that did not belong to them, lecturing me on financial responsibility. Just then, the hunger became too much for Mia. My 6-year-old daughter let out a loud, miserable wail. Her face turned red, tears streaming down her cheeks as she clutched her empty stomach. "Mommy, I want to go home," she cried, her voice piercing the quiet elegance of the restaurant. "I am so hungry." Penelope slammed her hands flat on the table, her eyes flashing with anger. "Can you please control your child?" she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "We are in a 5-star restaurant, Audrey. People are staring. She is completely ruining my luxury dining experience." My mother immediately took Penelope's side. "This is exactly what I meant, Audrey. You have no control over your life and clearly no control over your children. Take her outside right now. You are embarrassing DeAndre in front of his colleagues who might be dining here." DeAndre sighed loudly, running a hand over his face, as if he were carrying the weight of the world. "Just take the kids and go wait by the valet, Audrey. I will pay this massive bill as usual. Next time, do us all a favor and leave the kids with a babysitter, assuming you can even afford one." He pushed the heavy black corporate card closer to the edge of the table, waiting for the waiter to approach. He was so confident in his illusion of wealth, so secure in his role as the family savior. He had spent the last 2 hours treating me like garbage, flaunting his stolen corporate status and watching my children starve. I looked quietly at little Mia, tear-stained face, then at DeAndre, arrogant smirk. I looked quietly at little Mia tear-stained face, then at DeAndre arrogant smirk. Mateo, our impeccably dressed waiter, stepped up to the table. He carried a sleek black leather folio holding the wireless point of sale machine. He moved with the practiced grace of someone used to catering to the ultra-wealthy, offering the machine toward DeAndre with a polite nod. DeAndre reached out his fingers, brushing the heavy metal of his Apex Industries corporate card, ready to slide it into the reader and cement his status as the benevolent king of our family. This was the breaking point. I had spent my entire life biting my tongue to keep the peace. I had swallowed my pride when my mother drained my savings. I had smiled politely when Penelope paraded her unearned luxury in my face. But watching my brother-in-law use stolen corporate funds to buy his way into my mother's heart, while my daughter cried from hunger, was the line they should never have crossed. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped against the polished marble floor, a sharp, abrasive sound that cut right through the soft, ambient jazz playing in the background. I stood up to my full height. I did not glare or shout. I just smoothed the front of my simple navy blue dress and turned my attention entirely away from my family. Mateo, I said, my voice steady and carrying a quiet, unmistakable authority that immediately made the waiter freeze. Decline his card. The entire table went dead silent. Penelope paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. My mother's jaw actually dropped. DeAndre's hand hovered over the credit card machine, his arrogant smile freezing into a mask of pure confusion. Do not run that card, Mateo. I continued enunciating every single word, so that there could be absolutely no misunderstanding. The Apex corporate expense policy strictly forbids the use of company funds for personal family dinners. Section 4, paragraph 2 of their Financial Compliance Handbook explicitly states that entertaining non-business relations on a corporate account is considered a direct violation of corporate trust and is categorized as internal fraud. For a split second, the only sound at our table was the soft clinking of silverware from the dining booths across the room. Then DeAndre let out a sharp, mocking snort. He threw his head back and laughed, though the sound was hollow and instantly defensive. He looked around the table as if inviting Penelope and my mother to join in on the absolute absurdity of my statement. Listen to her, DeAndre scoffed, slapping his heavy hand against the mahogany table. Are you out of your mind, Audrey? Have you finally snapped from the stress of living paycheck to paycheck? You are a divorced paper pusher who probably spends her days formatting spreadsheets in a cubicle. How on earth would you know anything about the internal corporate policies of a multi-billion-dollar global conglomerate like Apex Industries? You do not even know what a real executive suite looks like. He grabbed the black card and shoved it aggressively toward the waiter. Run the card, man. Ignore her. She does not know what she is talking about. She is just bitter because her own marriage failed, and she cannot even afford to buy her kids a decent meal without my charity. Before I could even respond to his pathetic attempt at an insult, my mother exploded. The sheer panic of public embarrassment overtook her completely. She slammed her hands down on the table, her face flushing a deep, angry red. Audrey, sit down right this instant, Brenda hissed, her voice vibrating with barely contained rage. Have you lost your absolute mind? You are making a massive scene in a 5-star restaurant. DeAndre is trying to do something generous for us, and you are standing here throwing a jealous tantrum like a spoiled child. You are embarrassing this entire family. Stop acting like a crazy person and sit down before I have the manager throw you out myself. Penelope quickly chimed in, rolling her eyes dramatically and sighing loudly. Seriously, Audrey, this is pathetic even for you. You are so jealous of my husband's success that you are making up imaginary corporate rules to try and ruin our night. It is embarrassing. Just sit down, let the man pay for your free meal, and take your crying kids home. You are ruining my appetite. They were all staring at me with a mixture of disgust and pity. They fully expected me to shrink back into my chair, lower my eyes, and apologize. They expected the obedient, beaten-down scapegoat to accept her place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. They thought their combined anger would intimidate me into submission, but I did not sit down. I did not flinch. I just maintained my calm eye contact with the waiter who was still holding the credit card machine, looking incredibly serious and making absolutely no move to swipe DeAndre card. Mateo slowly lowered the leather folio containing the point-of-sale machine. He stood up a little straighter, adjusted his posture, and gave me a deep, respectful nod. "Understood, Madam VP," he said, his voice crisp and professional. "I will cancel the transaction immediately." DeAndre blinked, shaking his head as if he had water in his ears. "Excuse me," DeAndre snapped, pointing a thick finger at Mateo. "What did you just call her? And why are you listening to her? I am the one paying the bill. I am an executive at Apex Industries. You run my card right now, or I will have your job before dessert is served." Before Mateo could even respond to the threat, the heavy mahogany doors leading to the kitchen swung open. The general manager of Lumiere, a notoriously strict man named Vincent, who usually only interacted with elite celebrities and billionaires, practically sprinted across the dining room. His face was pale, and he looked completely terrified as he approached our table. He shoved past DeAndre without a glance and stopped directly in front of me, bowing his head in total submission. "Madam Vice President." "I am so incredibly sorry," Vincent gasped. "I had absolutely no idea you were dining with us tonight. The hostess did not flag your reservation because it was booked under your maiden name. If I had known the vice president of forensic accounting for the parent hospitality group was here in my restaurant, I would have cleared the private dining room exclusively for you and your beautiful children. Please accept my deepest apologies for any lapse in service tonight." Penelope's jaw dropped. The smug, condescending sneer vanished from her face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. She looked from Vincent to the waiter and then finally to me, her eyes wide with total disbelief. My mother let out a strange, choked gasp, her hand flying up to cover her mouth as she stared at me like I had just grown a second head. DeAndre's arrogant posture completely collapsed. The heavy black corporate card slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the hardwood table. "Wait!" DeAndre stammered, his voice suddenly lacking all of its previous booming confidence and aggressive swagger. "Vice president of what exactly? What parent hospitality group are you talking about?" Vincent turned his attention to DeAndre, his polite demeanor instantly freezing into a mask of pure, unyielding corporate steel. "Madam Audrey is the vice president of forensic accounting for the luxury hospitality conglomerate that owns Lumiere, along with 50 other five-star restaurants and luxury hotels across the country," Vincent explained sharply. "She is one of our highest-ranking corporate executives. She signs my paychecks and oversees all financial operations for this property." The silence that followed his declaration was deafening. The illusion they had built of me being a destitute, helpless single mother shattered into a million pieces. For 3 long years I had kept my promotion an absolute secret from every single one of them. When my ex-husband filed for divorce, he tried to take everything I had built, citing my future earning potential in court. I learned my lesson about protecting my financial assets the hard way. But more importantly, I knew exactly who my family was. I knew that if my mother found out I was pulling in a massive executive salary, she would suddenly have endless emergencies requiring my immediate financial rescue. I knew Penelope would demand I fund her lavish lifestyle because she felt she deserved it simply for being the golden child. And I knew DeAndre would constantly ask me for loans to cover his own reckless spending habits. Hiding my wealth was the only way to protect my children and their future from the financial parasitism of my flesh and blood. I deliberately lived far below my means, drove a sensible car, and let them mock my discount clothing, all while climbing to the very top of the corporate ladder. So when I told Mateo to decline the corporate card, it was not a bluff. It was a direct executive order. Penelope started sputtering visibly, struggling to form a completely coherent sentence. "But you work in a tiny cubicle," she managed to squeak out, her voice trembling with fear. You said you were just an accountant. I am an accountant, Penelope, I replied smoothly. A forensic accountant. I specialize in tracking down fraud, embezzlement, and unauthorized company spending. Which brings us back to that black card on the table. I turned my attention away from their stunned faces and looked back at Vincent, who was still standing at attention, awaiting my instructions. I completely ignored the heavy, suffocating silence radiating from my mother and sister. I reached out and gently took the leather-bound menu from Vincent, trembling hands. Vincent, I said warmly, dropping the corporate sharpness from my tone. My children have been waiting quite a long time to eat. Let us skip the appetizers entirely. I would like to order the $250 Wagyu tomahawk steak medium rare sliced thin for the kids to share. Please add a side of the beluga caviar, the truffle macaroni and cheese, and go ahead and prepare the gold leaf chocolate soufflés for their dessert. Vincent nodded furiously, pulling a sleek tablet from his jacket pocket to input the order directly to the executive chef. Excellent choices, Madam Vice President. I will personally ensure the kitchen expedites this immediately. How would you like the billing handled for this order? Bill it to my personal executive owner tab, I replied casually, handing the menu back to him. And bring them some of the sparkling apple cider and the crystal flutes while they wait. They have been incredibly patient tonight. Right away, Madam Vincent bowed again and quickly retreated toward the kitchen, snapping his fingers at two nearby busboys to clear the empty glasses from our side of the table. Leo and Mia instantly perked up their tired eyes, widening at the promise of steak and chocolate. I smiled at them, adjusting Leo's collar. My mother sat paralyzed in her chair, her mouth opening and closing like a fish suffocating on dry land. She looked at the cheap paper napkins she had thrown at my children earlier, then looked at me, completely unable to process the reality of the situation. Penelope was clutching her Chanel bag so tightly her knuckles were turning white. The dynamic had completely shifted, and the realization that I held absolute power over them was slowly sinking in. But DeAndre was not sinking in. He was boiling over. His entire identity was wrapped up in being the wealthy alpha male, the benevolent savior who controlled everyone around him with his wallet. Watching a woman, specifically the woman he had just spent an hour belittling, casually drop hundreds of dollars on a meal for her kids and command the respect of a high-end restaurant manager, was more than his fragile ego could handle. He slammed his fist down hard on the table. The crystal water glasses rattled dangerously, and silver flatware clattered against the porcelain plates. The loud bang echoed through the VIP section, causing several nearby patrons to jump in their seats. "Do you think this is funny?" DeAndre snarled, his voice a low, aggressive rumble. "Do you think you can just come in here, flash some fake corporate title, and embarrass me in front of my wife and my mother-in-law? You think you are some big shot because you manage the books for a restaurant." "I am not a bookkeeper, DeAndre," I corrected him calmly, not breaking eye contact. "And I did not embarrass you. You did that to yourself the moment you tried to pay for a personal family dinner with stolen corporate funds." DeAndre stood up suddenly, towering over the table. His chest was puffed out, his face twisted in a mask of defensive fury. "You listen to me, you arrogant little desk jockey," he threatened, jabbing his finger through the air toward my face. "I am a regional director for Apex Industries. I generate millions of dollars in revenue for that company. I am entitled to use my expense account however I see fit to entertain my family. It is a perk of the job, something a low-level bean counter like you would never understand." Penelope finally found her voice, her shrill tone piercing the air. "DeAndre is right, Audrey. You are just trying to cause trouble because you are miserable and alone. You are just a glorified accountant. DeAndre is an important executive." DeAndre pulled his smartphone from his suit jacket, waving it like a weapon. "You know what, Audrey?" He sneered, his thumb hovering over the screen. "I am done playing games with you. I have Richard Thorne's personal cell phone number right here, the CEO of Apex Industries. I play golf with Richard. I am going to call him right now and tell him that some mid-level auditor at this restaurant is harassing a top executive over a dinner bill." Let us see how long you keep your little vice president title when Richard calls your boss and demands your immediate termination. He stared down at me, waiting for panic. He wanted me terrified. He stared down at me, waiting for panic. He wanted me terrified. He wanted to see the familiar broken woman who had spent her entire life shrinking under the weight of this family expectations. He expected me to beg to retract my statements and to apologize profusely for challenging his authority in public. I did not give him the satisfaction of a single flinch. I sat perfectly still, my breathing steady, letting his hollow threats hang in the air until they sounded utterly ridiculous. The dining room around us had grown uncomfortably quiet, with other guests pretending to look at their menus while clearly eavesdropping on the spectacular meltdown happening at the VIP table. Without breaking eye contact with my raging brother-in-law, I reached down to the sleek leather tote bag resting beside my chair. I unzipped the main compartment and smoothly pulled out my silver tablet. The device felt heavy and substantial in my hands, a digital vault containing secrets that were about to decimate his entire carefully constructed universe. I tapped the screen, the biometric scanner instantly recognizing my fingerprint. The device unlocked with a soft click. I opened the encrypted file directory I had been working on tirelessly for the past 4 weeks. I turned the screen so it faced him and pushed the tablet slowly across the smooth mahogany wood. It stopped right next to his discarded corporate credit card. "Please call Richard," I said, allowing a slow, lethal smile to finally spread across my face. "I would actually prefer it if you called him right now. Put him on speakerphone. He has been waiting for my phone call all day." DeAndre's hand holding the smartphone slowly lowered. The vein throbbing in his forehead seemed to pulse a little less aggressively as confusion began to replace his manufactured rage. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice dropping an octave. The aggressive bluster suddenly faltering. "Why would the chief executive officer of my company be waiting for a call from a restaurant accountant?" Penelope leaned forward, her eyes darting between my calm expression and the screen of the tablet. "What is she talking about?" "DeAndre," she asked, her voice tight with a sudden creeping anxiety. Brenda was practically holding her breath, sensing the massive shift in power, but lacking the intellectual capacity to understand exactly what was happening. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, clasping my hands together. "Richard Thorne is not just the CEO of Apex Industries," I explained, keeping my tone conversational, but razor sharp. "He also sits on the board of directors. And exactly 1 month ago, that board realized they had a massive financial bleed in their quarterly projections. Money was hemorrhaging out of the company through unregulated corporate expense accounts and phantom vendor invoices. They needed an independent, ruthless forensic auditing firm to come and quietly bypass their internal finance team and find out exactly who was stealing from them." I paused, letting the word "stealing" echo at the table. DeAndre swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing visibly above his silk tie. "So the board hired my firm," I continued smoothly. "They gave me complete, unrestricted access to every single corporate server expense report and employee financial record at Apex Industries. For the last 4 weeks, my team and I have been tracing every missing dollar. We matched receipts, pulled surveillance footage from luxury boutiques, cross-referenced travel itineraries, and audited every single corporate card issued to the executive branch. We operated in total secrecy. No one in middle management even knew we were looking. You were so busy bragging about your promotions and throwing your weight around that you never noticed the digital tripwires my team was setting up right under your nose. You thought you were invincible because you manipulated the internal approval system, exploiting a loophole in the procurement software that only a highly trained forensic specialist would ever catch." DeAndre's face began to lose its color. The rich, confident complexion gave way to a sickly ashen gray. He stared at the tablet screen, but I could tell he could not even read the spreadsheet displayed there. His brain was too busy short-circuiting. "And do you want to know what I found, DeAndre?" I asked softly, tilting my head. "I found that the vast majority of the missing funds were siphoned through a single department. Your department." The target of my entire investigation is the regional sales division. Penelope let out a sharp gasp. No, she whispered, grabbing DeAndre's arm. Tell her she is lying. Tell her she is just trying to ruin us because she is jealous. But DeAndre did not speak. He could not. He just stared at the tablet, realizing that the trap had already sprung. The silence at the table was no longer filled with their arrogant mockery. It was filled with the absolute terror of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, and I was the one holding the lever. He looked at the screen again, finally focusing on the header of the document. It clearly displayed the Apex Industries logo next to a bold red stamp that read, Confidential Fraud Investigation. The numbers listed below it were undeniable, neatly categorized, and perfectly damning. He was completely cornered, entirely out of moves and entirely out of time. I did not give him a single second to catch his breath or concoct a lie. I reached out, tapped the screen of the tablet, and began reading the itemized list of his financial sins aloud. My voice was clear, carrying across the silent dining room like a judge delivering a final verdict. Let us start with the grand total, I announced, making sure my mother and sister heard every single syllable. Over the past 14 months, DeAndre has managed to rack up a staggering $150,000 deficit on his corporate expense account. My mother let out a strangled gasp, clutching the edge of the table as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from underneath her. $150,000, she repeated weakly, her eyes darting between me and her golden son-in-law. DeAndre, what is she talking about? Tell her she is reading it wrong. DeAndre opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He just stared at the tablet, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. I am reading it perfectly, Mother, I said, swiping down on the screen to pull up the individual transaction logs. I weaponized the data, using the cold hard numbers to completely dismantle his fake empire. Let us look at some of the highlights, shall we? On May 4th of this year, there is a $10,000 charge at the Chanel boutique downtown. The expense report claims this was for corporate client gifts. Strange, considering the only client who received anything that day was Penelope. I looked up from the screen, locking eyes with my sister. She was frozen, her hands resting exactly next to the gleaming Chanel bag she had brought into the restaurant. The very same bag she had flaunted at my house during Leo's birthday party, claiming DeAndre had surprised her because he was having such a phenomenal quarter at work. Penelope's face turned the color of chalk. She slowly turned her head to look at her husband. DeAndre, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. You told me that bag was from your mid-year performance bonus. You said the company rewarded you for landing the major corporate account. DeAndre swallowed hard, refusing to look her in the eye. Penelope, please just let me handle this, he muttered, his voice devoid of all its former arrogant swagger. Just be quiet for a second so I can think. Oh, there is no need to think, I interrupted brightly, tapping the screen again. The data does all the thinking for us. Let us move on to August. There is a $15,000 charge flagged under team building retreats. But according to the geo-tracking on your corporate card, this team building retreat took place entirely at a luxury, all-inclusive resort in Cabo San Lucas. I do not recall seeing any of your sales team in the photos Penelope posted on social media that week. Just the two of you drinking champagne on a private yacht. Penelope's breath hitched. The reality of her situation was crashing down on her like a physical weight. The first real crack in their perfect marriage ripped open right there at the dinner table. She had spent the last 5 years believing she was married to a high-powered executive, a financial titan who could effortlessly fund her every desire. She had used his wealth to establish her superiority over me, to mock my lifestyle, and to secure her place as our mother-favorite child. Now, sitting under the sparkling chandeliers of the restaurant, the horrifying truth was staring her right in the face. Her luxury life was not funded by success or hard work. It was funded by stolen money. She was carrying stolen goods, taking stolen vacations, and living a completely fraudulent existence. You lied to me, Penelope said, her voice rising in pitch as panic set in. You told me the Cabo trip was a reward. You told me we had plenty of money. You told me we were rich. We are rich, DeAndre hissed, finally snapping out of his paralyzed state. He grabbed her arm, trying to keep her voice down. Keep your voice down, Penelope. People are staring. I am just borrowing against my future commissions. It is a standard practice. I was going to pay it back before the end of the fiscal year. That is not how corporate accounting works, DeAndre. I corrected him coldly. You cannot borrow against commissions that do not exist. You manipulated the invoice approval software. You submitted fake invoices and funneled the money directly into your own pockets to pay for your wife designer clothes and your luxury vacations. That is felony wire fraud. And the board of directors does not take kindly to managers treating the company treasury like a personal piggy bank. Penelope ripped her arm away from his grasp, looking at him as if he were a stranger. She was not angry that he had stolen the money. She was angry that he had been caught and that her perfect illusion was about to evaporate. All of her smug superiority vanished, replaced by the sheer terror of losing her status. The golden child was suddenly facing the prospect of being married to a disgraced, unemployed criminal. The golden child was suddenly facing the prospect of being married to a disgraced, unemployed criminal who was about to lose absolutely everything. Before Penelope could fully spiral into a meltdown, my mother violently intervened. True to her nature as the ultimate toxic enabler, Brenda did not turn her shock toward the man exposed as a corporate thief. She did not comfort her weeping golden child. Instead, she turned her absolute unhinged fury entirely onto me. Are you happy now, Audrey? Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing loudly enough to make diners at the next table flinch. Her face was contorted with a vicious anger I had seen far too many times. Is this what you wanted? To destroy your sister marriage because you are so bitterly jealous of her happiness? I sat back completely unfazed by her outburst. I am not destroying anything, Mother, I replied calmly, gesturing toward the terrified, sweating man sitting across from me. DeAndre did that entirely by himself when he decided to commit felony fraud. I am simply the one who did the math. You did the math because you are a petty, vindictive woman, Brenda spat, pointing a shaking finger at my face. You could not keep your own husband, so you cannot stand to see Penelope with a man who takes care of her. You dug into his private business specifically to ruin him out of pure spite. It is not his private business when it is company money, I corrected her, keeping my voice level. And I did not single him out. I audited the entire regional division. He is just the only one arrogant enough to steal 6 figures to buy luxury handbags for his wife. Brenda slammed both hands down on the tabletop. Family protects family. Audrey, she screamed, completely abandoning any pretense of restaurant etiquette. You are a vice president. You have the power to fix this. You take that tablet right now, log into whatever system you use and delete that audit. You erase the file, cover his tracks, and let this go. I stared at her, genuinely astounded by her delusion. You want me to commit corporate treason and risk federal prison to cover up the fact that your son-in-law is a common thief? I asked, my tone dripping with absolute disbelief. He is not a thief, Brenda bellowed, her face turning crimson. He is a provider. He provides for your sister. He is under immense pressure to maintain their lifestyle, and sometimes good men make minor mistakes to keep their families happy. You have no idea the kind of stress he is under. He has been struggling with cash flow for months, and you are just making it worse. I raised an eyebrow, catching the slight hesitation in DeAndre's eyes. Struggling for months, I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. That is an interesting choice of words, Mother. Why would a highly paid executive with endless corporate perks be struggling with cash flow? Because the economy is hard, Brenda snapped defensively, and because he is trying to build a future. He had a temporary setback last year, that is all. It was a minor cash flow issue, and he was working on fixing it. I know he was. And how exactly do you know that for a certainty? I pressed, leaning forward slightly. Because I helped him, Brenda blurted out, her anger overriding her self-preservation. Because when he needed a little boost last year to cover some unexpected expenses, I stepped up like a real family member should. I loaned him $50,000 from my own retirement savings to help him out of a jam. That is what family does, Audrey. We sacrifice for each other. We do not throw each other under the bus. The silence that fell over the table this time was heavy, thick with the weight of a massive confession. DeAndre closed his eyes, his head dropping forward as if he had been physically struck. Penelope snapped her head toward our mother, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute confusion. "You gave him $50,000. Penelope whispered, her voice cracking. "Mom, you told me you could not afford to help pay for the boys' private school tuition last year because your pension was tied up." Brenda swallowed hard, suddenly realizing she had spoken entirely too much. "Well, I had to help him." "Penelope," she stammered, her aggressive bravado instantly deflating. "He promised he would pay me back with interest as soon as his quarterly bonuses cleared." I looked at my mother, a cold, calculated smile forming slowly on my lips. The trap had not just caught DeAndre, it had caught her too, exposing her ultimate betrayal against me. Penelope was staring at our mother as if she were a complete stranger. The golden child who had spent her entire life believing she was the center of a perfect affluent universe was watching the foundation of her reality crumble. "You mortgaged the house," Penelope whispered, the shock rendering her usually shrill voice completely flat. "The house that Grandpa built. You put a lien on it to pay for DeAndre mistakes, and you did not even tell me." My mother could not meet her gaze. She stared down at the expensive white tablecloth, her hands trembling as she picked at a loose thread. "I had to protect the family image," Brenda muttered weakly. "I could not let the country club ladies know DeAndre was having financial trouble. It would have ruined your reputation, Penelope. I did it for you." Penelope let out a harsh, bitter laugh, shaking her head in sheer disbelief. "You did it for yourself, Mom. You could not handle the embarrassment of having a son-in-law who was not perfect." "But at least DeAndre and I have our own assets," she said, her voice trembling as she desperately tried to rebuild her shattered superiority complex. She turned her tear-filled eyes toward me, her chin lifting in a pathetic, desperate attempt at defiance. "You might have caught him misusing a company card, Audrey, but we still have our home. We still have our cars and our investments. You cannot take those away from us. We will pay back the $50,000 and the corporate deficit. We will sell the house in the gated community if we have to. It is worth over $1 million. We have the custom marble kitchen and the heated infinity pool." I let out a slow, deliberate sigh, tapping the screen of my tablet to bring up the next encrypted file. I almost felt a microscopic fraction of pity for her in that moment, but then I remembered the cheap napkins thrown at my starving children, and the pity instantly vanished. "You cannot sell the house in the gated community." "Penelope?" I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch. Penelope scoffed, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "Watch me. It is in DeAndre's name. We have equity. We can list it tomorrow and be out of this mess by the end of the month. I am not going to let you sit there and act like you control my life." "It is not in DeAndre's name," I corrected her smoothly, sliding the tablet back across the table so she could see the screen. I opened the property records and the corporate lease agreements my team had pulled from the Apex Industries Human Resources database. "Your beautiful 5-bedroom house with the heated infinity pool is not yours. It never was. It is leased entirely under the Apex Industries corporate housing program. It is a perk reserved for regional directors who need to relocate frequently. DeAndre never bought that house. He just signed a corporate occupancy agreement." Penelope's face went completely blank. Her eyes darted wildly across the digital document, reading the Apex Industries letterhead and the bold print of the corporate housing addendum. "No," she gasped, shaking her head vigorously. "No, that is a lie. We went to closing. I picked out the custom countertops. I signed papers. You are just trying to scare me." "You signed a tenant preference form," Penelope Price replied mercilessly, stripping away her delusions piece by piece. "The company owns the property. They let you live there as long as DeAndre remains a high-standing executive. And that luxury SUV you drove here tonight? The one you made sure to park right up front with the valet so everyone could see it." Penelope's breath hitched in her throat. She looked at DeAndre, begging him silently to intervene to tell me I was insane. "DeAndre, tell her she is lying." Penelope pleaded, her voice cracking, but DeAndre was staring at his lap, thoroughly defeated, unable to look his wife in the eye. The SUV is registered to the Apex corporate fleet. I continued tapping the vehicle identification number on the screen. You do not own the car. You do not own the house. You own absolutely nothing but the designer clothes on your back, and even those were bought with stolen money. A low, agonizing whimper escaped Penelope's lips. She slumped back in her chair, the fight completely draining out of her. But it gets worse, Penelope, I said, leaning in closer, refusing to let her look away from the reality of her situation. When my forensic team flagged DeAndre for felony embezzlement yesterday evening, it triggered an automatic asset freeze within the Apex Human Resources Department. According to their corporate policy, any executive under active investigation for fraud immediately forfeits all company-provided housing and transportation. I paused, making sure she absorbed every single word of my next sentence. The housing lease was officially terminated by the legal department at 8 o'clock this morning. The property management company has already been notified. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises before corporate security arrives to change the locks and seize the vehicle. You are not going back to $1 million estate tonight, Penelope. You are essentially homeless. Penelope buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as a loud, ugly sob ripped through her chest. The reality of losing her precious status symbol was completely unbearable for her. The country club memberships, the neighborhood association meetings where she flaunted her superiority, the lavish playdates in her custom kitchen, all of it was gone. She was going to have to pack her designer clothes into garbage bags and walk out of that house a disgraced fraud. DeAndre could not handle the scene. His wife was hyperventilating, his mother-in-law was clutching her chest like she was having a cardiac event, and half the restaurant was now openly staring at our table. His fragile masculinity and desperate need to maintain control kicked into high gear. He needed an exit strategy, and he needed it immediately. He stood up abruptly, nearly knocking his heavy wooden chair backward onto the marble floor. "We are leaving," DeAndre announced loudly, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his personal leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a stack of premium personal credit cards. He was determined to salvage whatever tiny shred of dignity he had left by throwing money at the problem. "I am not sitting here and listening to this psychotic garbage for another second. Penelope, grab your bag. Brenda, get up. We are done here." He turned around and aggressively snapped his fingers at Mateo, who had been standing discreetly near the service station. "Check," DeAndre barked, waving a platinum credit card in the air. "Bring me the machine right now. I am paying for the chicken, the water, and whatever else is on my tab. I want to settle this and get my family away from this insane woman." Mateo stepped forward immediately. He still carried the black leather folio with the wireless point-of-sale terminal. He walked over to DeAndre with the utmost professionalism, completely unfazed by the screaming and the tension. Mateo took the shiny platinum card from DeAndre, trembling fingers slid it smoothly into the chip reader, and waited for the network connection. DeAndre glared at me aggressively, adjusting his silk tie. "You think you are so smart, Audrey," he sneered, trying to sound menacing. "You think a little corporate audit is going to ruin me? I have lawyers, expensive ones. I will drag you and that company through litigation for years. I have personal wealth that you cannot even fathom. You are nothing to me." The machine in Mateo's hand beeped loudly. It was a sharp negative tone. Mateo looked down at the digital screen. "I apologize," Sir Mateo said politely, but his voice carried clearly over the table. "The card has been declined." DeAndre's face flushed a deep, angry purple. He snatched the card out of the machine. "Your machine is broken," he snapped defensively, looking around to see if anyone at the neighboring tables had heard. "That is a platinum travel card. I have a $50,000 limit on that account and a zero balance. Run this one instead." He yanked another card from his wallet, a heavy metal rewards card, and shoved it into Mateo's hand. Mateo remained perfectly calm. He inserted the second card into the reader. The small screen flashed processing. DeAndre tapped his foot impatiently against the floor, glaring daggers at the waiter. Beep. Mateo let out a quiet sigh. I am sorry, sir. This card is also declining. It says contact your financial institution immediately for an explanation. Run it again, DeAndre shouted, completely losing his temper. He slammed his fist on the table once more. I said run it again. I have hundreds of thousands of dollars in those accounts. Stop playing games with me and run the damn card right now. There is no point in running it again, DeAndre, I said softly, picking up my glass of ice water and taking a slow, refreshing sip. The machine is not broken, and your bank is not experiencing a technical glitch. DeAndre spun around to face me, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and mounting panic. What did you do to my money? He demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I set the glass down and folded my hands neatly on the table. When I uncovered a corporate deficit of $150,000, I did not just send a memo to the Apex Industries Human Resources Department. Corporate embezzlement across state lines using digital banking infrastructure is not just an internal company matter, it is a federal crime. Penelope stopped crying and looked up, her mascara running down her cheeks in thick black rivers. Exactly 1 hour before I arrived at this restaurant tonight, I submitted my preliminary forensic report, complete with all of your forged invoices and unauthorized transactions, directly to the field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I explained, speaking slowly, so he could absorb the absolute gravity of his situation. When the federal authorities open a wire fraud investigation of this magnitude, their very first protocol is to freeze all connected financial assets to prevent the suspect from fleeing or hiding the stolen funds offshore. DeAndre stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. Your platinum card, your checking accounts, your savings, your investment portfolios. I listed them off casually. Every single piece of plastic in that expensive leather wallet is completely useless. They were frozen by a federal mandate at exactly 6:00 this evening. You literally do not have a single dime to your name. You cannot even afford to pay for the $99 chicken your wife just boxed up. The empire you built on stolen corporate cash has been completely dismantled. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed my declaration was absolute. Not a single person at our table dared to take a breath. Even the surrounding patrons in the VIP section seemed to freeze their forks, hovering halfway to their mouths, completely captivated by the unfolding disaster. DeAndre stood perfectly still, his platinum credit card still clutched weakly in his hand. His eyes wide and vacant as his brain struggled to process the sheer magnitude of his ruin. Penelope was slumped in her chair, weeping silently into her hands, while my mother simply stared at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Then, right on cue, a sharp, piercing ringtone shattered the quiet tension. The sound came from the inner pocket of DeAndre's tailored suit jacket. He flinched violently, as if he had just been electrocuted. His hand shook uncontrollably as he reached inside his jacket, his fingers fumbling awkwardly against the expensive fabric. He pulled out his sleek smartphone. The large digital screen was glowing brightly in the dimly lit restaurant, illuminating his terrified face. I did not need to actually see the screen to know exactly who was calling us, but DeAndre's reaction confirmed it instantly. All the remaining color drained rapidly from his face, leaving him looking exactly like a freshly reanimated corpse. "Who is it?" Penelope whispered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. She peered through her tear-soaked fingers, terrified of whatever new disaster was about to strike. DeAndre swallowed hard, his throat making a loud, dry, and distinctly clicking sound in the quiet space. "It is Richard," he finally croaked, his voice cracking like a terrified child. "It is Richard Thorne, the CEO." "Answer it," my mother hissed desperately, leaning aggressively across the table and physically grabbing his forearm. "Explain it to him, DeAndre. Tell him it is a massive misunderstanding. Use your charm. Tell him Audrey made a mistake with the accounting numbers. You play golf with this man. He likes you. Just talk your way out of it like you always do." But there was no charming his way out of a federal wire fraud investigation. DeAndre knew that. His hands were shaking so violently that the phone slipped from his sweaty grip. He scrambled to catch the expensive device before it hit the floor, bobbling it between his hands in a frantic, pathetic display of panic. As he fumbled, his thumb slammed against the bright green answer button and then accidentally swiped across the speaker icon. The phone clattered loudly onto the center of the mahogany table, landing face up right next to his declined credit cards. Before DeAndre could even reach out to snatch the phone back, a booming, furious voice erupted from the tiny speakers. It was a voice accustomed to commanding boardrooms and dictating terms, but right now it was laced with a level of pure, unhinged rage that made everyone in the room flinch. DeAndre, what in the absolute hell is going on over there? Richard Thorne bellowed. The CEO voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers and the marble columns of the dining room. I just got a call from our corporate legal department at my home. I am sitting here eating dinner with my family, and my general counsel tells me that the FBI just raided our digital servers with a federal warrant based on a forensic audit. DeAndre lunged for the phone, his fingers desperately clawing at the screen to turn off the speaker function, but his hands were shaking too much to register the touch correctly. Richard, sir, please. DeAndre stammered loudly toward the device, bending over the table. I can explain everything. There has been a terrible misunderstanding with the regional expense accounts. It is a clerical error. Do not you dare lie to me! The CEO roared, cutting him off completely. The sheer volume of Richard's voice made Matteo the waiter take a step back. I have the preliminary forensic report sitting right in front of me on my desk. It was just emailed to me and the entire board of directors by our lead auditor. I am looking at $150,000 in stolen funds. I am looking at fake invoices for luxury vacations and designer clothing. You arrogant, stupid man. Did you really think you could treat Apex Industries like your own personal trust fund, and we would never find out? DeAndre opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound emerged. He was entirely paralyzed by the public execution of his professional career. The entire restaurant watched in stunned silence as the most powerful man at his company delivered the final crushing blow over the speakerphone for everyone to hear. There was truly no escape from this devastating reality facing him. The voice of Richard Thorne continued to radiate from the device, completely merciless and entirely devoid of the friendly country club banter DeAndre had always bragged about. As of this exact moment, DeAndre, your employment at Apex Industries is officially terminated, the CEO announced, enunciating every single syllable with lethal precision. You are fired effective immediately. Your dismissal is categorized under gross misconduct, embezzlement, and systemic corporate fraud. Do not attempt to log into any of your employee portals or access your company email accounts. Our information technology department disabled your credentials and wiped your company-issued devices over an hour ago. You no longer exist in our system. DeAndre tried to lean forward, his hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table, so tightly his knuckles turned a sharp, translucent white. He opened his mouth, gasping for air, as if the oxygen had been suddenly vacuumed out of the VIP dining room. Richard, please. DeAndre managed to choke out his voice, barely a raspy whisper. I have given 10 years of my life to building the regional sales division. I increased revenue by 30% last quarter alone. Let me come into the office tomorrow morning and we can sort out the numbers privately. There is no office for you to come into. Richard barked back, his tone laced with absolute disgust. You do not have a desk anymore. Corporate security boxed up your personal belongings at 5 o'clock this evening. They dumped your framed family photos and your cheap golf trophies into a cardboard box and left it with the loading dock supervisor. You are permanently banned from entering any Apex Industries facility nationwide. If you step foot on our property building, security will have you arrested for criminal trespassing. And do not think for 1 second you are going to bounce back from this and find a job at a competitor, the CEO continued. I have already made phone calls to the board members of every major corporation in our industry. I told them exactly what you did. Your reputation in the corporate world is permanently destroyed. You will never work in management again. You will be lucky if you find someone willing to hire you to scrub toilets. DeAndre's chest began to heave violently. His breathing turned into rapid, shallow gasps. The walls of the luxurious restaurant were closing in on him. He clawed at the collar of his expensive silk tie, ripping it downward in a desperate attempt to get more air into his collapsing lungs. He was hyperventilating. Sweat poured down his face in thick streams, soaking into the pristine collar of his custom-tailored dress shirt. The man who had spent the entire evening mocking my financial status and threatening the restaurant staff was now crumbling into a pathetic, trembling mess. Penelope sat perfectly still, staring blankly at the glowing phone. She could not process the fact that the lavish lifestyle she had built her entire identity upon was being brutally ripped away over a speakerphone call. Brenda, the ultimate enabler, covered her face with her hands, letting out a series of low whimpers. She was not crying for DeAndre. She was crying because her own precious social standing was evaporating right before her very eyes. "You made an absolute mockery of my company," Richard growled through the speaker. "You used our funds to buy designer trash for your wife and fund luxury vacations while actual hardworking employees relied on us for their livelihoods. Did you really believe your pathetic little invoice manipulation scheme would survive a forensic audit?" DeAndre let out a strange, high-pitched wheeze. His eyes rolled back slightly as his panic attack reached its absolute peak. He grabbed his water glass with trembling fingers, trying to take a sip to wet his completely dry throat. His hand shook so badly that the crystal glass slipped from his weak grip. It hit the mahogany table and shattered instantly, sending ice water cascading onto his lap. He did not even seem to notice the freezing water. He just kept gasping loudly, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled out of the ocean. He tried to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse or plea for mercy, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The sheer terror of his impending criminal charges had paralyzed his entire nervous system. "The federal authorities have the entire file right now," Richard continued loudly. "The federal agents told me they have enough evidence to secure a conviction 10 times over. They have your direct signature on every single fraudulent expense report. You are absolutely going to federal prison, DeAndre. The only question now is exactly how many years the judge is going to give you for stealing 6 figures from a publicly traded corporation." The speakerphone crackled with the heavy breathing of the furious executive on the other end of the line. DeAndre remained frozen, water dripping from his ruined suit pants to the marble floor, completely incapable of formulating a single coherent thought. But Richard Thorne was not quite finished completely dismantling the life DeAndre had built on lies. "And one last thing," the CEO barked, his voice laced with a cold, triumphant satisfaction. "Do not even bother trying to go back to the corporate house in the gated community tonight. The legal department dispatched our private security team there an hour ago to secure the premises, and they are not alone. The local police department is currently sitting in your driveway. They are waiting there right now to serve you with a federal search warrant and physically seize all the luxury assets you purchased with my company money." The words hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the absolute reality of the situation crashed down on Penelope. She let out a sudden, blood-curdling shriek that echoed off the high ceilings of the restaurant. It was a visceral, guttural scream of pure agony, the sound of a woman watching her entire universe collapse into dust. She violently pushed herself away from the table, her chair tipping backward and crashing loudly onto the floor. "No," Penelope screamed, pulling desperately at her own perfectly styled hair. "No, no, no. My house. My things. You cannot let them take my things, DeAndre. All my jewelry is in that house. My designer bags, the kids' custom furniture, my entire wardrobe. You have to stop them. Call someone. Fix this right now." She grabbed DeAndre by the shoulders, shaking him violently, but he was like a rag doll. The entire facade of her perfect, wealthy life had completely disintegrated in less than 10 minutes. The country club memberships, the boastful social media posts, the arrogant superiority she had held over me for her entire adult life. It was all gone. She was no longer the affluent, envied wife of a high-powered corporate director. She was the homeless spouse of a disgraced, unemployed felon about to face federal prosecution. Through the speakerphone, Richard Thorne let out a short, humorless laugh. "There is no fixing this, Penelope," the CEO said coldly, showing absolutely no sympathy for her hysterical meltdown. "Every single item inside that property is now considered evidence of federal wire fraud or an asset subject to corporate seizure. You own nothing. Enjoy your dinner." Click. The line went dead, leaving a dial tone that sounded like a flatlining heartbeat echoing from the device. DeAndre stared blankly at the phone, his chest heaving, his eyes completely hollow. He had lost his job, his wealth, his home, and his freedom, all before the main course had even arrived at the table. My mother Brenda was breathing in rapid, shallow gasps. She looked wildly around the room, her eyes darting between the staring restaurant patrons and the sobbing wreck of her favorite daughter. The public humiliation was a fate worse than death for a woman who valued social appearances above absolutely everything else. She reached out with trembling hands, trying to grab Penelope's arm to silence her screaming. "Penelope, please," Brenda hissed desperately, her voice cracking under the immense strain. "Stop screaming. Everyone in the restaurant is looking at us. We have to maintain our dignity. We can figure this out. We can call your uncle or perhaps reach out to the church. Just please stop making a scene." "Dignity," Penelope shrieked, ripping her arm away from our mother grasp. "I do not have a house, Mom. My husband is going to federal prison. The police are throwing all my belongings into evidence boxes right now. Do not talk to me about dignity. We are completely ruined." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting neatly on my lap, watching the absolute destruction of the people who had spent their entire lives trying to destroy my self-worth. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or regret. They had built their fragile glass castle on a foundation of lies, theft, and cruelty. I had simply handed them the hammer and watched them swing it. DeAndre finally managed to drag his eyes away from the dead phone. He looked at me, his expression twisting from shock into a pathetic, desperate realization. The aggressive tyrant who had demanded the waiter decline my orders and threatened to have me fired was completely gone. In his place sat a broken, terrified man who suddenly understood that I held his entire fate in the palm of my hand. He slowly slid out of his chair, his knees buckling slightly as his feet hit the polished marble floor beneath the table. His expensive suit trousers absorbed the cold impact of the marble as he dropped entirely to his knees right there in the middle of the VIP dining room. The heavy thud of his body hitting the floor drew even more gasps from the surrounding tables. The arrogant, untouchable executive from an hour ago was completely gone. In his place was a desperate, hyperventilating man who had finally realized that his massive ego was absolutely no match for a meticulously documented spreadsheet. DeAndre reached out with trembling, sweaty hands and grasped the edge of the mahogany table directly in front of me. His knuckles turned white as he clung to the polished wood like a drowning man clutching a life raft. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, bloodshot and overflowing with sheer panic. The drastic contrast between his current pathetic state and his earlier boastful cruelty was almost cinematic. "Audrey, please," DeAndre begged, his voice cracking violently. "You have to fix this. You have to call Richard back right now." I looked down at him, my expression completely neutral. "Why would I do that?" DeAndre, I asked softly. "Because you are the vice president of the auditing firm," he practically screamed, his voice echoing over the quiet murmurs of the stunned restaurant patrons. "You have the power to change the numbers. You can log into the system and alter the forensic accounting report. Just delete the file. Tell the board of directors it was a massive clerical error. Tell them the accounting software glitched and miscalculated the corporate expenses. Tell the FBI you made a terrible mistake and withdraw the preliminary report. You can make all of this go away with one phone call." I stared at him, genuinely fascinated by his absolute lack of morality. You are asking me to commit a federal crime, destroy my own professional career, and risk going to prison myself, just to cover up the fact that you stole $150,000, I stated clearly, making sure everyone around us understood exactly what he was demanding. You are family. My mother suddenly shrieked, leaning over the table. She pointed a shaking finger at my face. You are supposed to sacrifice for your family. You cannot just sit there and let him go to jail. DeAndre nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face and soaking into his ruined silk collar. I will pay it back, Audrey. I swear on my life I will find a way to pay the money back. I will take out loans. I will sell everything. Just give me time. I am the father of your nieces. You cannot let me go to federal prison. He was so panicked he could not even remember the gender of his own twin boys, stumbling over his words as his mind completely unraveled under the immense pressure. But his frantic pleading only solidified my resolve. Penelope suddenly dropped to the floor beside him, her expensive Chanel bag completely forgotten. She grabbed the hem of my navy blue dress, her mascara-stained tears ruining the fabric. Audrey, please, she sobbed, burying her face against my knees. I am so sorry for everything I said tonight. I am sorry for making fun of your clothes. I am sorry for telling you to feed your kids before you came. We were just joking. Please do not take my house away. Please do not let them arrest my husband. The country club will ban me. My friends will never speak to me again. I will have absolutely nothing. Even in her absolute lowest moment, Penelope only cared about her social status. She was not crying because her husband was a criminal. She was crying because she would no longer be invited to luncheons and charity galas. I gently but firmly pulled the fabric of my dress out of her desperate grip. I pushed my chair back slightly, putting physical distance between myself and their pathetic groveling. You both seem to be operating under a massive delusion, I said, keeping my voice steady and completely devoid of empathy. You think I did this to you out of spite. You think this is some kind of personal revenge plot that I can just magically undo. I leaned forward, looking directly into DeAndre's bloodshot eyes. I did not force you to steal corporate funds, DeAndre. I did not force you to swipe that black card, to buy luxury handbags and vacations. I simply did my job. I followed the digital trail of stolen money exactly where it led. The federal government does not care about clerical errors, and they certainly do not cancel active investigations just because a suspect starts crying in a fancy restaurant. But we are family. DeAndre sobbed loudly, his forehead resting against the edge of the table. You did not treat me like family an hour ago, I reminded him coldly. You treated me like a worthless charity case. You sat there and laughed while my children cried from hunger. Now you expect me to save you from the very real consequences of your own greed. That is simply not how the real world works. I looked down at the pathetic man kneeling on the restaurant floor, feeling zero empathy. He was sweating profusely, his clothes ruined, his dignity stripped away. I thought about the arrogance he had displayed just an hour ago, waving that corporate card like a weapon. I thought about the napkins my mother had thrown at my starving children, while he laughed and told me to feed them before arriving. You did not care about my kids when they were hungry, I stated, my voice echoing coldly. You sat there and mocked me. You laughed and humiliated my children. Why should I care about your freedom now? DeAndre flinched as if I had struck him across the face. He opened his mouth to formulate another excuse, but I raised my hand to silence him. Do not try to manipulate me, DeAndre, I commanded sharply. And do not try to use my nieces as collateral for your bad decisions. You should have thought about your children before you decided to forge company invoices and steal from a corporation. You built a house of cards using stolen money to feed your own massive ego and your wife's insatiable need for luxury. I did not make you swipe that card. I did not force you to take those illegal vacations to Cabo. I simply did my highly paid job. I did the complex math, and the financial numbers absolutely do not lie. My mother, desperately trying to control a situation that had completely spiraled out of her grasp, pushed herself up. Audrey, You have to find some compassion in your heart, Brenda pleaded, though her voice carried a bitter edge of toxic entitlement. This is family. We are your blood. You cannot just cut us off and watch us burn. We will go to counseling. We will figure out a repayment plan. But you have to call Richard Thorne back right now and stop the federal agents. You owe us that much as a loyal daughter and a sister. I turned my gaze directly to my mother, letting her clearly see the unbreakable boundary I had finally erected between us. I owe you absolutely nothing, Mother, I replied, my tone completely devoid of the blind submission she expected from me my entire life. For 33 years, I have been the family scapegoat. I have been the quiet punching bag you all use to make yourselves feel superior. You drained my savings to cover your own hidden debts, and you belittled my achievements so Penelope could shine brighter. I protected my children from your toxicity by keeping my distance and my financial success a total secret. I stepped back, crossing my arms firmly over my chest. I am not a helpless divorced paper pusher who needs your misguided pity. I am a vice president of forensic accounting. I get paid a ridiculous amount of money to systematically hunt down corporate parasites and expose them to the authorities. When the board of directors hired my auditing firm, they demanded total transparency and absolute ruthlessness. If you think I am going to compromise my professional integrity, lose my lucrative executive position, and risk facing federal obstruction charges just to save a man who treated my children like garbage, you are entirely out of your mind. Penelope was still weeping on the marble floor, her hands desperately clutching the leather strap of her useless designer bag. She looked up at me, her face smeared with expensive makeup, her expression a pathetic mix of terror and disbelief. "But what are we going to do, Audrey?" she whimpered loudly. "Where are we going to go tonight? We have no money, we have no house, we do not even have a car to drive away from this restaurant. The police are waiting for us right now." That sounds like a massive logistical problem for a man who proudly claimed to be a top-tier provider, I said, looking right past her directly to DeAndre. But it is certainly not my problem. The days of me fixing your endless mistakes are permanently over. You have officially crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. I am setting a hard, ironclad boundary right here and right now. I will not engage with your emotional manipulation. I will not be guilt-tripped into bailing you out of a catastrophic mess you created entirely by yourselves. DeAndre dropped his head heavily into his hands, letting out a long, agonizing groan that sounded exactly like a dying animal. He finally understood that there was no hidden loophole, no secret family pardon, and absolutely no way to talk his way out of a federal indictment. The solid, unbreakable wall I had built around myself and my children was completely impenetrable. Their lives were now ruined. Their lives were now ruined. My mother refused to accept that reality. Brenda scrambled out of her chair, her face streaked with a mixture of melted cosmetics and genuine terror. She dropped to her knees right beside him, wrapping her arms protectively around his trembling shoulders, as if she could physically shield him from the consequences of his own actions. "Audrey, listen to me," Brenda wailed, her voice cracking hysterically. "We can fix it. We just need to pay back the corporate deficit. If we give the money back to Apex Industries, Richard Thorne will have to drop the charges. We can make restitution." I looked down at her, raising an eyebrow. "And exactly how do you plan to pay back $150,000, Mother?" "DeAndre accounts are completely frozen by the federal government. Penelope has absolutely no income, and you just admitted you drained your own retirement savings. You are all completely broke." "We will sell the house," Brenda blurted out, her eyes wide and manic as she desperately grasped at straws. "The family house. It is easily worth $500,000. I can list it tomorrow morning. I will call a real estate agent tonight. We will use the equity to pay off the second mortgage, and then we will give the rest directly to DeAndre so he can pay back the company. We will save him, Audrey. We will keep him out of federal prison." Penelope suddenly looked up from the cold floor, a glimmer of desperate hope flashing in her swollen, tear-filled eyes. "Yes, she gasped, nodding frantically. Yes, Mom. We can rebuild. We just need the equity from the house. Watching them actively plot to liquidate my childhood home to save a corporate thief was the absolute pinnacle of their endless toxic entitlement. I let out a low, sharp laugh. It was a cold sound that immediately shattered their brief moment of hope. I reached back into my leather tote bag. My fingers bypassed the silver tablet and grasped a thick, heavy manila envelope. I pulled it out and held it up under the warm glow of the restaurant chandeliers. You are not selling the house, Mother, I said, my voice dripping with absolute authority. Brenda glared at me, her maternal rage briefly overriding her panic. It is my house, Audrey, she snapped defiantly. I make all the financial decisions. I have the deed and I will sell it if I want to. You cannot stop me from saving him. I slowly untwisted the red string securing the heavy manila envelope, savoring every single second of the suspense. I reached inside and pulled out a stack of crisp, legally notarized documents. I tossed the thick packet onto the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud right next to DeAndre's useless platinum credit cards. Actually, I can stop you, I corrected her smoothly, because it is no longer your house to sell, Mother. Brenda froze. What are you talking about? She whispered, her eyes darting to the legal documents. When I ran the background financial checks for my audit, I found the second mortgage you secretly took out last year, I explained clearly. The one where you illegally forged my signature as a co-signer because your own credit score was completely destroyed. That is a felony, bank fraud. But instead of turning you into the police for identity theft, I decided to handle it privately. Since you missed the last 4 payments and the loan was heading into default, the bank was happy to offload the toxic asset. I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch for maximum impact. I used my yearly executive bonus to buy the debt in its entirety. I fully paid off the bank. I legally own the mortgage now. And since you violated the terms of the loan by defaulting, I officially foreclosed on the property 3 days ago. The deed was legally transferred to my holding company. Brenda let out a choked gasp, clutching her chest as if she could not breathe. You took my home, she whimpered, turning pale. You stole the family home. I did not steal anything from you, I replied coldly. You gambled it all away on a fraudulent son-in-law, and I simply bought it back to protect my own future financial standing. I slid the top piece of paper from the thick stack and handed it directly to my stunned mother. She took it with violently shaking hands. It was a formal document, bearing the seal of the county clerk. That is a formal 30-day eviction notice, I announced loudly, looking down at the 2 broken women kneeling on the restaurant floor. You cannot sell my house, Mother. But you really do need to pack. The sheer finality of that statement hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Penelope stared at the legal document in our mother trembling hands. Her eyes tracked the official county seal, the bold print of the foreclosure, and the undeniable reality of the eviction notice. The last fragile thread tethering her to her delusion of grandeur violently snapped. She was entirely broke. She was effectively homeless. And she was legally bound to a man who was moments away from becoming a convicted federal felon. The quiet, pathetic weeping that had consumed Penelope suddenly stopped. Her tear-soaked face hardened, contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She slowly turned her head toward DeAndre, who was still kneeling on the floor, staring blankly at the shattered glass and spilled water. You lied to me, Penelope hissed. Her voice was no longer a shrill cry for help, it was a venomous growl. DeAndre flinched, instinctively pulling back. Penelope, listen to me, he started, but he never got the chance to finish the sentence. Penelope lunged at him. She threw herself across the short distance separating them, her manicured hands curling into fists. She slammed her fists directly into his chest, hitting him with a wild, desperate strength. You ruined my life, she screamed, striking him again and again. You disgusting, pathetic liar. You let me believe we were rich. You let me brag to my friends. You let me buy things with stolen money. You made me a criminal by association. Everyone is going to laugh at me. The whole neighborhood is going to see the police raid our house." She hit him harder, her expensive rings catching the fabric of his silk tie and ripping it. DeAndre tried to put his arms up to shield his face, stumbling backward awkwardly on his knees. "Stop it!" DeAndre yelled, grabbing her wrists to halt the assault. "Penelope, stop hitting me! You are making a scene." "I am making a scene," Penelope shrieked, wrenching her hands free and slapping him hard across the face. The sharp crack echoed through the dining room. "You just got fired on speakerphone for stealing $150,000. You are going to prison. I have absolutely nothing because of you. I married a complete fraud." The physical blow finally shattered DeAndre's own fragile restraint. The groveling, terrified man vanished, replaced by a cornered animal, lashing out at the nearest target. He violently pushed Penelope away. She stumbled backward, her expensive heels catching on the marble floor, sending her crashing hard onto her hands and knees. "Do not you dare act like a victim!" DeAndre roared, scrambling to his feet. His face was purple with rage, the red mark from her slap glowing brightly on his cheek. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You bled me dry, Penelope. You and your endless, greedy demands." Penelope gasped, looking up at him in shock. "You are blaming me for your felony," she cried out. "I am blaming you for driving me to it," DeAndre screamed back, completely abandoning any sense of public decorum. He pointed a shaking finger at her face. "I made a great salary, a fantastic salary, but it was never enough for you. You had to have the $10,000 Chanel bags. You had to have the luxury vacations to Cabo so you could post photos and compete with those shallow country club wives. You threatened to leave me if I did not upgrade your diamond ring. You told me I was not a real man unless I provided a millionaire lifestyle." My mother tried to stand up to intervene, but her legs gave out. She slumped back into her chair, covering her ears as her perfectly curated family tore each other to absolute shreds. "You are the provider," Penelope screamed, pointing right back at him. "It was your job to figure it out without committing a federal crime. You told me you were getting bonuses." "There were no bonuses," DeAndre bellowed, his voice cracking violently. "I maxed out my personal credit cards a year ago trying to keep you happy. I took out secret loans. When those ran out, you demanded more. You demanded the private school tuition. You demanded the custom infinity pool. I only manipulated those invoices because I was absolutely terrified of you realizing I was just a regular guy. I stole that money to buy your love because you never loved me. You only loved what I could buy for you." The absolute truth of his words hit Penelope like a physical blow. The ugly, rotten foundation of their marriage was completely exposed under the bright chandeliers of the restaurant. They were not a powerful, wealthy power couple. They were two incredibly toxic, insecure people who had fed off each other greed until it destroyed them both. They continued to scream, hurling vicious insults and airing their darkest secrets. I sat back in my chair, sipping my ice water, watching the sibling war unfold. I did not need to offer a single counter-argument or defend myself anymore. The villains were completely annihilating each other. Penelope lunged forward again, her manicured fingers clawing at the expensive fabric of DeAndre's ruined suit jacket. Her shrieks had reached a deafening pitch that completely overpowered the soft ambient jazz music playing through the restaurant overhead speakers. Diners at the surrounding VIP tables were no longer just discreetly glancing in our direction. They were openly glaring, leaning away from the spectacle of my family tearing themselves apart on the marble floor. A wealthy older couple at the booth next to ours actually stood up, tossing their cloth napkins onto their plates in absolute disgust, and signaled their waiter for an immediate check. The elegant, sophisticated atmosphere of Lumiere had been entirely shattered by the toxic, chaotic reality of the people I had the misfortune of calling my blood relatives. I watched the older couple rush out of the dining room, and I decided the entertainment portion of the evening had officially reached its conclusion. I placed my crystal glass of ice water carefully back onto the mahogany table. The sharp clink of the glass against the wood was soft, but in my mind it signaled the absolute end of their reign of terror over my life. I raised my right hand slightly in the air and snapped my fingers. It was a single sharp sound, but it carried an immense weight of corporate authority. Vincent, the general manager, who had been hovering nervously near the kitchen doors, immediately sprang into action. He did not come alone. 4 large, incredibly intimidating restaurant security guards marched swiftly behind him. They were not standard bouncers. They were highly trained professionals dressed in immaculate black suits with discreet coiled earpieces, employed specifically by the parent hospitality group to handle high-profile security threats. Because I was the vice president of that exact parent company, the guards moved with a rapid, unquestioning military precision. They bypassed the horrified diners and surrounded our table in a tight, impenetrable formation. Vincent stepped forward, bowing his head slightly toward me. "Madam Vice President," he said, his voice loud enough to cut through Penelope, hysterical sobbing. "How would you like us to handle this disturbance?" I did not stand up. I simply leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs, and gestured casually toward the 3 pathetic figures groveling around my table. "These people are no longer welcome in this establishment, Vincent," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, but laced with absolute steel. "They are currently trespassing on private property, creating a massive public disturbance, and as we just witnessed, they are completely unable to pay for their dining bill. Please escort them out immediately." My mother had snapped up so fast I thought she might injure her neck. "Audrey!" She gasped, her eyes wide with a fresh wave of sheer terror. "You cannot be serious. You cannot throw your own mother out onto the street like a common criminal. People are watching us. The country club ladies dine here every weekend. If they see me being dragged out by security, my social standing will be permanently destroyed. I will be ruined." I looked right through her, feeling absolutely nothing. "You ruined yourself, Mother," I replied coldly. "Security removed them from my sight." The 4 massive security guards did not hesitate for a single second. They stepped forward simultaneously. 2 of the guards reached down and grabbed DeAndre by his upper arms. DeAndre tried to instinctively pull away his shattered ego, attempting one last pathetic display of physical resistance. "Get your hands off me," he snarled, trying to shake off the strong grip of the men holding him. "I am a regional director. You cannot treat me like this." But the guards simply tightened their hold, lifting his entire body off the floor with effortless, terrifying strength. The pathetic fight drained out of him instantly as he realized he was completely powerless against them. The 3rd guard approached Penelope, who was still kneeling on the marble floor, clutching her empty Chanel bag to her chest like a useless life preserver. "Come along right now, Mom," the guard said firmly, gripping her elbow and hauling her roughly to her feet. Penelope did not even try to fight him. She just hung her head, sobbing loudly, her expensive mascara smudged into dark, ugly circles around her eyes. The final guard stepped behind my mother's chair. Brenda gripped the wooden armrests, refusing to stand, shaking her head in total denial of the situation. "Ma'am, you need to vacate the premises right now," the guard ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority across the room. "Do not make me physically lift you out of that chair in front of everyone who is currently dining here this evening. It is time to leave immediately." My mother stared up at the massive security guard, her mouth opening and closing in stunned silence. She looked around the VIP room, searching desperately for a sympathetic face, an ally, anyone who would intervene and save her from this ultimate degradation. But there was absolutely no one. The wealthy patrons of Lumiere, the very people whose approval she had spent her entire life chasing, stared back at her with expressions of pure disgust. Realizing that the guard was entirely prepared to drag her out by her arms, Brenda slowly pushed herself up from the chair. Her legs trembled so violently that she had to grip the edge of the mahogany table just to steady herself. "Move along," the guard commanded, gesturing toward the main exit with a firm sweep of his hand. The procession of shame officially began. The 4 security guards formed a tight perimeter around my disgraced family, marching them away from my table and directly through the center of the crowded dining room. It was a long, agonizing walk. Lumiere was designed with an open concept floor plan, meaning every single table had a perfect view of the spectacle. The soft ambient jazz seemed to fade completely into the background, replaced by the sharp rhythmic thud of the security guards' heavy footsteps against the marble floor. As they were paraded past the velvet booths and crystal chandeliers, the social annihilation I had promised them became a brutal reality. Several patrons at the surrounding tables did not just watch. They actively reached into their expensive purses and suit jackets to pull out their smartphones. The bright flashes of camera lights began to pop across the dimly lit room. People were recording the entire meltdown. The elite socialites my mother and sister desperately worshipped were now capturing their lowest moment to share on social media platforms. Penelope realized exactly what was happening. She let out a mortified gasp and immediately raised her Chanel bag, pressing the quilted leather tightly against her tear-stained face to hide her identity from the glowing camera lenses. It was a poetic, pathetic image. She was using a luxury handbag purchased with stolen corporate funds as a desperate shield to protect whatever tiny shred of dignity she believed she had left. But the expensive bag offered absolutely no protection. Everyone in the dining room already knew exactly who she was. They had heard her screaming about losing her house and her status. Her fake wealthy facade was permanently shattered, captured in high-definition video from multiple angles. DeAndre did not even try to hide his face. The aggressive, boastful executive who had demanded the waiter run his platinum cards was entirely gone. He walked with his head hung low, his shoulders slumped forward in total defeat. His expensive silk tie was torn and hanging loosely around his neck. The front of his custom-tailored dress shirt was completely soaked with the ice water he had spilled during his panic attack. He dragged his feet across the marble, looking exactly like a convicted prisoner taking his final walk toward the gallows. He knew the people recording him were likely industry executives, venture capitalists, and corporate heavyweights who would ensure he never worked in a respectable office ever again. Brenda walked behind him, her face flushed a dark, humiliating crimson. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, terrified to make eye contact with the country club ladies sitting near the front of the restaurant. I watched her pass the hostess stand, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She had sacrificed my childhood, my finances, and my emotional well-being to maintain the illusion of a perfect family. Now that illusion was being forcefully marched out the front doors for the entire city to see. The heavy glass doors of the restaurant swung open, pushed wide by the leading security guard. A blast of cool night air rushed into the lobby. The guards did not simply ask them to step outside. They physically guided DeAndre, Penelope, and my mother out onto the concrete pavement of the valet drop-off zone. The wealthy diners sitting near the windows watched intently as my family stumbled onto the sidewalk, completely disoriented and entirely broke. The security guards immediately stepped back inside and pulled the heavy glass doors shut, locking them with a loud, definitive click. Just like that, the trash was out. Inside the dining room, a brief, stunned silence lingered for a few seconds. Then slowly, the low murmur of conversation resumed. Crystal glasses clinked. I remained sitting perfectly still at my table, taking a deep breath, finally feeling incredibly light and completely free. The nightmare was over. I looked at my two beautiful children who were completely unaware of the absolute chaos that had just unfolded. The nightmare was over. I looked at my two beautiful children who were completely unaware of the absolute chaos that had just unfolded. Leah was entirely focused on a small puzzle game on my phone, and Mia was quietly coloring on the back of a paper coaster with a crayon I kept in my purse. They had been insulated from the worst of the screaming by the sheer size of the dining room and their own innocent distractions. The faint muffled sound of Penelope still wailing on the sidewalk outside quickly faded into nothingness as the heavy glass doors sealed shut. The sophisticated ambiance of Lumiere smoothly reasserted itself. The soft jazz music swelled slightly, filling the tense void left behind by my family, and the surrounding patrons returned to their own conversations. At that exact moment, the heavy mahogany doors leading to the kitchen swung open. Mateo emerged carrying a massive, gleaming silver platter balanced perfectly on his shoulder. He was followed closely by a junior server, pushing a small table-side cart. The rich, intoxicating aroma of roasted garlic brown butter and perfectly seared beef preceded them, cutting through the lingering tension at our table. Mateo stopped directly in front of us, giving a small polite bow. "Your dinner, Madam Vice President," he announced proudly. He carefully lowered the silver platter onto the center of the table. It was a culinary masterpiece. The $250 Wagyu tomahawk steak was cooked to an absolute medium-rare perfection, resting on a wooden carving board. The dark caramelized crust gave way to a vibrant, tender center that practically melted on sight. Beside the massive steak sat a delicate glass bowl resting on crushed ice filled with the beluga caviar I had ordered. The junior server placed a steaming ceramic dish of truffle macaroni and cheese directly in front of Mia, the golden, bubbling cheese emitting a scent so rich it made my own mouth water. "Wow," Leo whispered, his eyes widening as he dropped the phone and stared at the feast. "That is the biggest steak I have ever seen in my whole life." Mia clapped her small hands together, her earlier hunger tears completely forgotten. "It smells so good, Mommy," she cheered happily. Mateo produced a razor-sharp carving knife and swiftly sliced the Wagyu beef against the grain, separating the rich meat from the massive bone. He arranged the perfectly portioned slices onto 2 warm porcelain plates and gently set them down in front of my children. "Please enjoy," he smiled warmly before retreating toward the service station to give us some privacy. I picked up a silver fork and knife, leaning over to cut the meat into smaller, bite-sized pieces for Mia. The Wagyu was so incredibly tender, it barely required the knife at all. I scooped a generous portion of the truffle macaroni and cheese onto her plate and handed her the fork. "Go ahead and eat, sweetheart," I told her softly. "You do not have to wait another second." Watching them dig into the luxurious meal was the most deeply satisfying experience of my entire life. Leo closed his eyes as he chewed the steak, letting out a happy hum of pure culinary bliss. Mia was happily twirling the cheesy noodles around her fork, her face glowing with simple, innocent joy. They were safe, they were fed, and they were completely loved. As I sat there watching them enjoy the feast of victory, my mind drifted briefly to the sharp, poetic contrast of our current realities. We were sitting in a climate-controlled VIP dining room, surrounded by crystal chandeliers, eating one of the most expensive cuts of beef in the entire city. Meanwhile, just a few feet away on the other side of the glass doors, the people who had treated us like worthless garbage were standing on the cold, concrete sidewalk. The autumn night air outside was unforgiving. Penelope was shivering in her sleeveless designer dress, clutching a fake handbag that would not pay for a taxi ride. DeAndre was standing in a soaked, ruined suit, completely unable to call a transportation service because his corporate phone was wiped and his credit cards were frozen. My mother, who had prized social dignity above her own daughter, was now stranded on a street corner, hiding her face from passing cars. They had aggressively denied my starving children a few scraps of leftover chicken. They had laughed at our supposed poverty and demanded we leave their presence. Now my children were dining like royalty on my personal corporate tab, and the villains of my story were quite literally out in the cold, facing the absolute destruction of their fraudulent empire. I took a piece of the steak for myself. It tasted like justice. Exactly 1 week later, that taste of justice was served on a much larger, highly public scale. The swift and brutal machinery of the federal justice system did not waste any time. By Tuesday morning, DeAndre's face was plastered across the front page of the local business journal and featured prominently on the morning news broadcasts. The headline was merciless reading: Apex Industries Regional Director arrested in massive corporate embezzlement scheme. Sitting in my quiet, sunlit kitchen with a fresh cup of coffee, I watched the television screen as they displayed his official booking mugshot. The transformation from the arrogant, tailored executive at the restaurant to the man in the photograph was striking. DeAndre looked completely hollowed out. His eyes were wide and terrified, his skin pale, and the smug superiority that had defined his entire personality was entirely erased. The news anchor detailed the charges of wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate grand larceny. They mentioned the luxury vacations and the high-end designer goods purchased with stolen funds. The broadcast effectively served as his permanent exile from the corporate world. No respectable company would ever touch him again. He was currently sitting in a federal holding cell, unable to post the massive bail the judge had set due to his frozen assets. While DeAndre was getting acquainted with his concrete cell, Penelope was experiencing her own rapid descent into a completely unfamiliar reality. The Apex Industries legal department had not bluffed about the corporate housing situation. Less than 24 hours after the restaurant incident, a fleet of moving trucks and corporate security officers had arrived at her luxurious gated community. Neighbors peeked through their custom blinds as Penelope was forced to hastily pack whatever personal belongings were not considered evidence or purchased with stolen money. She had to leave behind the custom furniture, the imported rugs, and the majority of her expensive wardrobe. With her bank accounts frozen and absolutely zero income of her own, she had no options. The golden child who had spent her entire adult life looking down on my sensible lifestyle was forced to relocate her twin boys into a cheap, cramped motel on the absolute outskirts of the city. Through a mutual acquaintance who could not wait to share the gossip, I heard all the grim details of her new living arrangement. Penelope was currently residing in a single room with 2 double beds that smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach. There was no custom marble kitchen, only a noisy mini-fridge and a microwave with a missing button. There was no heated infinity pool, just a cracked asphalt parking lot overlooking a busy highway. The woman who had complained about my children ruining her luxury dining experience was now trying to feed her own kids instant noodles using plastic utensils. Desperation makes people do incredibly foolish things, and Penelope was no exception. Unable to handle the crushing weight of her new reality and desperate for validation, she turned to the only place she thought she still had power: social media. On Thursday evening, she uploaded a long, tearful video to her accounts. She sat on the edge of the sagging motel bed, strategically angling the camera to show the depressing wallpaper behind her. She wore no makeup. Her hair was messy and she cried directly into the lens. She attempted to spin a massive web of lies, playing the ultimate victim. She claimed that DeAndre was framed by a corrupt corporate system. She sobbed about being unfairly targeted and entirely blindsided. Then she took direct aim at me, crying about an evil, jealous sister who had orchestrated her downfall and refused to help her own nephews in their darkest hour. She begged her followers for prayers and directed them to a crowdfunding campaign she had set up to afford a lawyer. She expected an outpouring of sympathy, financial donations, and a mob of angry people rushing to defend her honor. Instead, the internet did exactly what the internet does best. It absolutely destroyed her. Her comment section became an immediate brutal war zone. Former friends from the country club who she thought were her loyal allies instantly distanced themselves. They left scathing comments calling her a fraud and demanding to know if the expensive gifts she had given them were bought with stolen money. Strangers mocked her fake tears. But the absolute final nail in the coffin came when someone anonymously uploaded a video from Lumiere. A patron at the restaurant had recorded the entire meltdown. The video clearly showed Penelope screaming about her designer bags and her luxury house, while DeAndre admitted to stealing the money to fund her lifestyle. It showed the security guards dragging them out. The video went viral locally within hours. People flooded her crowdfunding page, reporting it for fraud until the platform completely shut it down. The comments under her tearful video shifted from mockery to absolute outrage. Users pointed out the staggering hypocrisy of a woman crying in a motel when she had happily lived on stolen corporate funds while looking down on everyone else. Penelope had tried to manipulate the public narrative, but she only managed to amplify her own absolute humiliation. She was forced to delete her social media accounts entirely, silencing the golden child once and for all. While Penelope was busy destroying whatever remained of her dignity on social media, my mother was experiencing a much quieter but equally devastating social execution. Brenda's entire existence revolved around her perceived status among the affluent women of the local country club. These were women who judged each other based on the zip codes of their homes, the brands of their luxury vehicles, and the professional success of their sons-in-law. For years, Brenda had paraded DeAndre's success around the clubhouse like a trophy, using his forged wealth to secure her position at the top of the social hierarchy. She had hosted lavish luncheons funded by my stolen savings and bragged endlessly about Penelope's perfect marriage. When the local business journal published DeAndre mugshot, the news spread through the country club faster than a wildfire. But the final lethal blow to Brenda's social standing was the viral video from Lumiere. The country club ladies watched in high definition as the woman who constantly preached about elegance and etiquette was physically escorted out of a five-star restaurant by security guards because her family could not afford to pay for a chicken dinner. The social excommunication was immediate and absolute. On Wednesday afternoon, Brenda attempted to attend her weekly bridge club meeting, desperately hoping she could spin the situation and play the victim. She put on her best designer outfit, applied her makeup meticulously, and walked into the clubhouse dining room with her head held high. She did not even make it to her usual table. The club president, a formidable woman named Eleanor, who had never particularly liked my mother, intercepted her near the entrance. Eleanor did not raise her voice, but her tone was sharp enough to cut glass. "Brenda," Eleanor said, looking my mother up and down with barely concealed disgust. "I think it would be best if you left. The board convened this morning. Your membership has been suspended indefinitely pending a formal review regarding conduct unbecoming of a club member. We simply cannot have someone associated with federal wire fraud and public disturbances dining in our establishment." Brenda tried to argue, her face flushing crimson, but Eleanor simply turned her back and walked away. The other women in the dining room actively averted their eyes, pretending to be deeply engrossed in their salads and iced teas. No one offered a word of support. No one rushed to her defense. My mother was officially a social pariah, cast out of the only world she actually cared about. Her downfall did not stop at the country club doors. The 30-day eviction notice I had handed her in the restaurant was not a bluff, and my legal team moved with ruthless efficiency. With her retirement savings completely gone and her social network entirely severed, Brenda had absolutely nowhere to go. She could not afford to rent an apartment in her preferred zip code, and she certainly could not swallow her pride enough to ask her former friends for a loan. Out of sheer desperation, Brenda was forced to pack 2 suitcases of her most prized possessions and take a cheap rideshare service to the outskirts of the city. She arrived at the depressing, cramped motel where Penelope was currently residing. The reunion between the toxic mother and her fallen golden child was anything but heartwarming. When Brenda knocked on the peeling door of room 212, Penelope did not welcome her with open arms. The small motel room was already suffocatingly crowded with 2 restless young boys, a noisy mini-fridge and luggage piled in the corners. Penelope was exhausted, humiliated from her social media disaster, and furious at the world. "You have to sleep on the floor," Penelope snapped as Brenda dragged her heavy suitcases into the room. "The boys are sharing one bed, and I am taking the other." "I told you not to come here, Mom. There is no room. I am your mother." "Penelope." Brenda shrieked back, her own frayed nerves finally snapping. "I took out a second mortgage to save your criminal husband, and this is how you treat me. I lost my house because of you. I lost my country club membership because of you." The tiny motel room instantly became a pressure cooker of toxic resentment. The 2 women who had spent their entire lives bonding over their shared superiority and mutual disdain for me were now trapped together in a squalid, depressing reality of their own making. Without my financial support to act as a buffer, and without DeAndre's stolen money to fund their illusions, their relationship rapidly deteriorated. The golden child blamed her mother for taking the house from me and getting caught. The toxic mother blamed her daughter for driving DeAndre to steal in the first place. They fought constantly, screaming at each other over the noise of the highway traffic outside their single window. They were completely broke, entirely isolated, and utterly miserable. They had finally been forced to face the exact ugly reflection of their own character, and they absolutely hated what they saw. The poetic justice of their situation was almost too perfect to put into words. The poetic justice of their situation was almost too perfect to put into words. Later that evening, I sat in the living room of my own home, far from the cheap motel and highway noise surrounding my mother and sister. My house was a sanctuary of peace, quiet, and security. I purchased the property 3 years ago, selecting a quiet street with excellent schools for Leo and Mia. The interior featured warm hardwood floors, soft linen furniture, and large windows letting in natural light. There were no forged documents hiding in my desk drawers, and absolutely no unpaid bills threatening my peace of mind. I poured myself a glass of red wine to celebrate the absolute finality of the week sinking into the plush cushions. The house was completely silent. The children were fast asleep upstairs, completely oblivious to the dramatic downfall of the relatives who had constantly looked down on them. I reached for my smartphone resting on the coffee table. The screen displayed a barrage of notifications I had actively ignored for days. There were dozens of missed calls, frantic text messages, and long rambling emails from various family members who had finally caught wind of the spectacular restaurant incident and DeAndre's subsequent arrest. But there was one specific notification that caught my attention. It was a 3-minute voicemail from my mother. I took a slow sip of the rich red wine, savoring the complex flavors, and pressed play. The audio filled the quiet living room, and the sound of my mother's voice was instantly recognizable, though it lacked all of its usual arrogant command. Brenda was sobbing uncontrollably, her breaths coming in ragged, pathetic gasps. It was the sound of a woman who had finally hit rock bottom and realized that the only person capable of pulling her out was the very daughter she had spent decades actively pushing away. "Audrey, please pick up the phone," Brenda pleaded through the speaker, her voice thick with mucus and desperate tears. "I know you are there. I know you are listening. You have to help us. Please, Audrey. I am so incredibly sorry for everything. I was wrong. Penelope was wrong. We never should have treated you that way at the restaurant. I am your mother, and I love you. You are my daughter. You cannot just abandon us like this." I rested my head back against the sofa cushions, listening to her empty apologies. They were not rooted in genuine remorse. She was not sorry for stealing my savings or for treating me like a second-class citizen my entire life. She was only sorry that her golden child was broke, her favorite son-in-law was in jail, and her social life was destroyed. "We need money, Audrey." The voicemail continued, the true motive finally revealing itself through the hysterical crying. "DeAndre needs a high-powered criminal defense attorney. The public defender told him he is facing 10 to 15 years in federal prison. We cannot let that happen. It will destroy the family name forever. The lawyer requires a $50,000 retainer fee just to take the case. I know you have the money. You bought my mortgage. You are a corporate executive. Please just wire the funds to my account. Consider it a loan. We will pay you back. I promise we will pay you back every single cent. Do not let your nephews grow up with their father in a concrete cell. Please call me back immediately." The voicemail ended with a series of loud, pathetic sobs before the line finally disconnected. I sat perfectly still in the quiet warmth of my beautiful home, waiting to see if I felt even a microscopic ounce of guilt. I searched my heart for any lingering familial obligation, any small voice telling me to step in and save them from their catastrophic mistakes. But there was absolutely nothing. The emotional manipulation that once controlled my every decision had completely lost its power. The heavy, suffocating chain of toxic guilt that my mother had wrapped around my neck since childhood was finally gone. I looked at the digital recording on my phone screen. I did not feel pity. I did not feel anger. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of profound relief. I pressed my finger against the delete button, instantly erasing the voicemail from my device and from my life. With deliberate, methodical movements, I opened my contact list. I selected Brenda number and hit block. I selected Penelope number and hit block. I blocked DeAndre along with every other toxic relative who had enabled their behavior over the years. The digital barriers were instantly erected. The toxic cord was permanently severed. Exactly 1 month after that quiet evening in my living room, my physical surroundings finally matched the absolute magnitude of my internal peace. I stood in the center of my brand new corner high-rise glass office. The space was massive, encased entirely in floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the sprawling city skyline below. The morning sun reflected off the sleek glass buildings, casting a warm, triumphant glow over my custom mahogany desk and the pristine white leather chairs. This was not the tiny, windowless cubicle my family had mocked and imagined me suffering inside. This was the executive suite, the absolute summit of the corporate mountain. The heavy wooden door to my office opened with a soft click. Richard Thorne, the chief executive officer of Apex Industries, walked into the room. It was the first time I had interacted with him in person since the night his furious voice echoed through the VIP dining room over a dropped speakerphone. In person, Richard was an imposing figure, a man who commanded immediate respect, but as he approached me, his demeanor was one of total professional admiration. He extended his hand. I reached out and shook it firmly. Audrey, Richard said, a genuine smile breaking across his sharp features. The board of directors finalized the paperwork this morning. It is completely official. The forensic audit you delivered was flawless, but your ability to handle the resulting fallout with such absolute precision and total discretion is what truly impressed us. You excised a massive tumor from our regional division before it could metastasize into a public relations catastrophe. You saved this company millions of dollars in future losses and exposed a security flaw we desperately needed to close. I offered a polite nod. I simply did my job, Richard. The numbers told a very clear story, and I made sure you had the entire narrative without any emotional interference. You did far more than that, he countered smoothly, releasing my hand. Which is exactly why the board was entirely unanimous in their decision. Congratulations, Audrey. Effective immediately, you are the new Chief Financial Officer of Apex Industries. The title hung in the air, a massive validation of every single sacrifice I had made over the past 3 years. Chief Financial Officer. I was no longer just the vice president of a subsidiary hospitality group tracking missing funds. I was now holding the financial reins of the entire multi-billion-dollar global conglomerate. I thanked him, and we spent a few minutes discussing the upcoming quarterly projections before he excused himself to prepare for an afternoon press conference. When the heavy door clicked shut behind him, leaving me completely alone in the massive glass suite, I walked over to the edge of the windows. I placed my hands lightly against the cool glass and looked down at the bustling city streets far below. The cars looked like tiny metal ants, the pedestrians just insignificant specks moving through the urban grid. I allowed myself a long, deep moment of reflection. The journey to this exact spot had been paved with a lifetime of silent endurance. For 33 years, I had played the role assigned to me by a deeply toxic family. I had been the scapegoat, the financial safety net they happily drained, the quiet punching bag they used to elevate their own pathetic self-esteem. I endured my mother draining my savings, Penelope flaunting her unearned luxury, and DeAndre treating my children like inconvenient burdens. When my ex-husband tried to destroy me in family court, I learned the crucial power of absolute silence. I learned that the greatest weapon you can wield against greedy, arrogant people is to let them underestimate you completely. I hid my promotions. I drove a sensible car. I wore discount clothes. I let them mock my supposed poverty while I quietly built an impenetrable fortress of wealth and power right beneath their noses. They built their entire lives on a fragile illusion of superiority, funded by stolen money and blatant lies. When the illusion finally shattered, they had absolutely nothing left to catch them. They were currently rotting in a cheap motel and sitting in a federal holding cell because they believed they were invincible. They believed they could treat people like garbage without ever facing a single consequence. I looked out at the skyline, a cold, satisfied smile slowly spreading across my face. My mind drifted back to that incredibly tense night at Lumiere. I pictured DeAndre sitting there with his arrogant smirk waving his stolen corporate card. I pictured Penelope rolling her eyes clutching her fake Chanel bag. I pictured my mother tossing a cheap paper napkin across the mahogany table telling my hungry children to wait. They told me my kids could eat when we got home. They were right. But they did not realize that while they were splitting a $99 chicken, I owned the whole slaughterhouse.